Okay, YouTube, in our last video, we looked at evaluating functions, especially using function notation. In this video, we're going to focus on still function notation, but what we call piecewise defined functions. So piecewise defined functions, let's go ahead and read this here. It's pretty basic. We say that it's a function defined by two or more equations over a specified domain. Okay, we'll refer to this as a piecewise function. And really, what a piecewise function is just some function here, like you see f of x. And what this is saying is, in order to find your y value at a given x value, you're going to use these rules, except for what this says is you use the rule x squared plus 1 if you're going to plug in an x value that is less than 0. So we're going to make a little note here. Use if x is less than 0. And in this case, we're going to use the second rule, x minus 1, if x is greater than or equal to 0. So in other words, your function's outputs depend upon what you're going to plug into it in the first place here. So since we're going to be evaluating here, let's go ahead and do this. Let's make a table of values, and we're going to still call this f of x. Excuse me. But what I want you to see is this. We're going to evaluate this function when x equals -1, 0, and 1, and talk about, well, then where would I place these values? So let's start with -1 here. -1, in terms of where do I plug this into the function? Do I use both rules? Well, because we're going to use this top rule if our input is less than 0 and -1 is less than 0, we're going to use this top rule here, which says what we're going to do is substitute in for our x value our input. And so in this case, we get -1 squared, which of course is 1 plus 1 here, and we get 2. So the idea here would be this. It implies that in this function, when we plug in -1, we get an output of 2. That would be, say, on a graph if we plotted that. Now, when we look at plugging in 0, the question becomes, okay, do I plug it into the first rule or second rule? Well, the second rule says to use this rule if what you're plugging in, your x value, is greater than or equal to 0. So because 0 is actually equal to 0 here, we're going to use the bottom rule for this one. So when I plug in 0 into my table, I'm not going to use x squared plus 1. Instead, I'm going to use my rule that's listed here, and that's x minus 1. So I'm going to put in a 0 for my input here, and what we end up with is just 0 minus 1 or -1. So what this implies is when I plug in 0 then, 0, I'm going to get -1 for an output. And then, of course, you might have already implied this, but if you plug in a 1, 1 is definitely greater than or equal to 0. So again, we're going to use the second rule here because our input is greater than or equal to 0, or at least satisfies the conditions for the second rule. So we're going to get 1 minus 1, which is 0. So with this relationship here, we could say that when we plug in 1 for our input, we get 0 for our output there. So piecewise defined function just means use the appropriate rule for the appropriate or given input value or domain value. Cheers.